Hey, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I see that more and more colleagues are joining us as we speak. That's really good news. Right now, we have 14 participants, and I'm sure that more other colleagues will join us on our way. Welcome to this thematic working group meeting of the Local Public Sector Alliance on subnational finance. My name is Elton Tafa, and I work with NALAS. And for those of you that don't know NALAS, NALAS is an umbrella organization that brings together local government associations from Southeast Europe. And I was invited by LPSA to join the working group on subnational finance and then contribute with the coordination of the quarterly meeting. This is the second meeting that myself and my two colleagues, Titilola and Gundula, which you can see here, are coordinating. So thank you for joining us and for taking the time. Today, before we start with the exchanges, perhaps I would invite Jamie to provide a couple of remarks on LPSA and on the structures of LPSA. And then we'll dive directly into an exchange on personal income tax sharing. On tax sharing as an instrument to finance municipal services in Europe, but also in the world. So thank you very much for that. In terms of the agenda, here we'll have today with us, we'll have three speakers in the panel. We'll have three speakers. First is Professor Tony Levitas from Brown University. Tony's been working on municipal finance and decentralization policy in Europe, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, and Western Balkans, Southeast Europe as well. So, and Tony is also one of my mentors in municipal finance. So we started our partnership almost 9 years ago, and it's been great working with him. So I'm really happy that Tony could join us today and share a little bit more on his decades of experience in decentralization policy and fiscal decentralization in Europe. Then I'll have the second speaker would be also my dear friend and colleague Dario Runtic from the Association of Croatian Cities, and also an advisor to the Minister of Finance of Croatia. And Dario is one of our leading experts in municipal finance in Southeast Europe, and he's also one of the top experts of the NALAS Fiscal Decentralization Task Force. So thank you, Dario, as well for joining us and taking the time. Last but not least, we'll move from Europe as an experience. So we'll have Kudadat. Kudadat is an economist at the World Bank, and he will be sharing out the experience with the personal income tax sharing reform in Indonesia. So thank you, Kudadat, for taking the time and for sharing the great work that you and Roy Kelly have been doing together on this. So we have this excellent panel, and I'm really thrilled that we're here today. After we finish, we'll have some brief presentations, and I already discussed with the panelists that we will keep them more on a conversational style, so that it's we create more opportunities for interaction and exchanges. So we'll have a session on Q&A as well. So please feel free to reach out to us with the questions that you may have. You may write them in the chat. My colleague Mirna will help me with the questions so that we can respond to them. And yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you very much again for joining us, and I look forward to this 1 hour and something conversation on a topic that's also very dear to me. But before that, maybe Jamie, you can take over and then explain a little bit more about LPSA and why we're here and what we're doing. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much for that introduction, Elton, and thanks everyone for joining. Thanks in advance to the colleagues and panelists. Unfortunately, we can't be in a room in Malaga where we can have a nice dinner afterwards, as some of us recently had. But it's nonetheless great to have an inspiring conversation about a topic in which I know or on which I know relatively little. So actually, I wasn't planning to make any remarks today, but Elton, as the co-chair of the working group, insisted I say a few words, so I'm obliging. But I'm very thankful that we have such a great panel. And this is exactly why we, as the Local Public Sector Alliance, set up working groups. As you all know, decentralization and localization is a very complex animal, and each of us as professionals working in that field typically only look at part of that elephant. We might focus on fiscal aspects or democracy aspects or conflict aspects or different aspects of decentralization and localization. And over the past year, we've started a journey of decentralizing ourselves as an alliance so that working groups can share topics like today's topic on piggyback taxation, so that we can all stay current, so we can learn from each other, so we can exchange. So thank you all very much for joining today's conversation. I hope that everyone in the room has signed up as a member of the Local Public Sector Alliance and the Finance Working Group. If not, Myrna will in a moment put in the chat a link to the sign-up sheet, so that you can get reminders when we get together next on exciting topics, either related to subnational finance or any of the other regional working groups or thematic working groups that we have as an alliance. Let me leave it there. Back to you, Elton. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks in advance for an exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, now I'm even more convinced that it was really good to have also a broader introduction of LPSA. All right, from my perspective, I'll keep my introduction very short, also because Tony has made a great presentation about it. But in general, personally, I mean, tax sharing is an important instrument on local government finance. In some countries, it is more than in others. And there are many questions that regulators have to face when they decide to engage into tax sharing. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity today to discuss more on those. We'll definitely hear more on these tensions, but then I would be really happy if we can all discuss about them in the Q&A session. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Tony Levitas for the first presentation on the tax sharing as an instrument to finance municipal governments. So Tony, the floor is yours. Feel free to share the screen.
Thank you, Elton. Thank you all for your kind introductions. Why isn't this showing the full screen? Let's see. There we go. Can people see the screen?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
So what I thought that I would do today, I mean, first, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And it's great to see many old friends and colleagues, and to meet some new people. So what I thought I would do is kind of set the stage with personal income tax as a municipal revenue, and why I think it's kind of under considered in the world in which we work. And that I'll begin with a kind of very stylized take on Anglo-Saxon fiscal federalism. Really, our normative rudder in the world in which we work hasn't changed that much, though it's frayed at the edges, and it descends from Musgrave and Oates in some ways, but mostly Musgrave. And the basic idea with Musgrave and the fiscal federalists is that, at least at the municipal level, municipalities should pay for most of their responsibilities through benefit taxation, meaning taxes in proportion to the use or wealth of property, and that the ad valorem property tax imposed at a flat rate is the best municipal tax because it captures use while the immobility of its base limits fiscal competition. In Musgrave's world, in the world of fiscal federalism, you know, the sharing of the personal income tax was really never seriously considered. I think primarily because Musgrave saw it as a national government function, that progressive taxes should be used by the national government for redistribution, and that at the local level they didn't really have that much place. And moreover, at a local level, personal income tax sharing would incentivize fiscal competition between local governments. And despite the fact that Thibault was Musgrave's student, Musgrave was not a big fan of fiscal competition per se. So the idea in most of the institutions we've worked with, I think, has been that the sine non qua of local taxation really should be the ad valorem property tax. And over the years, I've been involved, I cannot say in how many USAID or World Bank projects in which the primary objective with respect to local government revenues is to build an ad valorem, or indeed any property tax system, to provide municipalities with their revenues. That stylized take on what normative vision of fiscal federalism has very, very, very little to do with really existing European fiscal federalism, just as an empirical matter. I mean, Europe makes very little use of the property tax, which typically yields little more than 1% of the GDP in revenue. And most of that yield is coming from businesses, not residents. I mean, this compares to America and to Canada, the Anglo-Saxon countries, where the property tax typically yields closer to 2.5 or between 2 and 2.5% of the GDP. And there are outliers like Hong Kong and so on where it's higher. But again, in Europe, and I would venture from what I know of Latin America, despite years and years of investment in ad valorem property taxes, there are very few countries in which it yields more than a percentage of GDP in revenue. Instead, in Europe, PIT is often the single largest source of municipal revenue. In Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, it is as an own revenue, with cities setting the rates within base and rate limits prescribed by the national government. The extreme case, the outlier case here, is Sweden, where the national government essentially gets none of the personal income tax, and 100% of the yield goes to municipalities, and municipalities set the rate of the tax within bracket limits set by the national government. In much of the rest of Europe, and particularly in post-communist Europe, it is a shared tax. So Germany, Poland, Norway, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Serbia, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, which also uses local PIT surcharges, I think also in some German Länder, but I'm not sure. But and then in Romania and Ukraine as a shared tax. In Romania and Ukraine, it's problematic, and it's a problem that occupies a lot of my days these days, because it's allocated by place of work. And we can talk about that later in the discussion and why that's the case. It's, I think, one of the reasons why PIT sharing has not moved as rapidly in some Latin American countries as it might, essentially because the national government is using companies as tax agents for the collection of PIT, and the national government, in fact, does not know where the employees live. But leaving that aside for the moment, what we see in Europe is that where municipalities have significant functions, they're typically being assigned 40 to 60% of the PIT generated on their territories. At the same time, the most important national government is VAT and not PIT, meaning that redistribution is being largely funded through regressive taxes. I mean, the not very secret, dirty little secret of the European welfare state is that it is being funded on the back of a regressive tax. So two questions, what explains the popularity of municipal PIT sharing in Europe in general and in post-communist Europe in particular? And why has the European reality been largely ignored in the mainstream discussion of decentralization and development? Now, I haven't been in the consulting world for about 10 years. I've been primarily at Brown pretending to be a professor, but so I don't know whether the debate within the development community has moved much in the last 10 years, but when I left it as a kind of full-time occupation, PIT sharing was kind of not on anybody's real radar. I could say a lot about both questions, but we'll leave the second one for our discussion and tell a kind of origin story for the expansion of PIT as a municipal revenue in Europe. The origin story really begins in the 1980s in Scandinavia, where the Scandinavians want very badly to decentralize their welfare states and spend most of the 1980s consolidating 19th century, if not 17th century jurisdictions with lots of small jurisdictions, small rural jurisdictions, into larger units with the specific intention of giving those larger units significant new public functions. So the consolidation facilitates the assignment of early childhood education, K through 12 schooling, and elderly care to municipalities, functions that had all been previously been performed by the national government, financed and managed directly by the national government, and they're now being transferred to local governments. And it's kind of clear, even though most of Scandinavia had reasonably well-working property tax systems, that all of this is going to be too much to be funded from the property tax. And they move en masse to making the personal income tax not a shared tax, but an own revenue. And the consolidation of the jurisdictions limits the fiscal competitions that making the personal income tax an own revenue might invite, because it's now too far for the rich in downtown Gothenburg or Stockholm to move outside and still have the benefits of city life. During the 1980s, and thinking about what to do after their fall, there are a group of Polish administrative lawyers who are watching what the Scandinavians are doing. And in fact, they're involved in research teams with the Scandinavians, and they're seeing this process of consolidating jurisdictions, as well as the municipalization of their social orders. In none of the Scandinavian countries are regional governments very important. In Denmark and Sweden, they do play a significant role in the health system, but they don't do much other things. When the wall finally comes down in Poland, the local government groups that have been thinking about life after the fall see municipalities, not regions, as the best way to break up the single party state and to build from the bottom up the political parties they don't have. So in Poland, there's a very explicit rejection of democratization at the regional level first, and instead we're going to do this at the municipal level, and we want to give the municipalities as many functions as we can, both to dismantle the communist state, the single-party state, as well as to relieve the state of the day-to-day burdens of worrying about, whether the toilets are flushing and where the sewage is running. And as soon as they make that decision that they want to endow municipalities with significant social sector functions, it's very clear to them that they're going to have to do this on the back of transfers, right? And the two most important local government revenues in Poland are a per capita, per pupil education grant, and a 40% share of the personal income tax generated on their territories. From the national government's point of view, pit sharing is a technically easy way to fill the vertical gaps they know decentralization will create. And this is true. It's technically easy to do this so long as pit can be linked to place of residency, which is admittedly not often the case. As I said, Ukraine, Colombia, Albania, Romania, there are lots of countries where, because the national government is relying on companies as tax agents, the national government doesn't actually have a record of where taxpayers' employees reside. In any case, the decision to share pit at the municipal level is a resounding success at the local level for some good reasons and some bad reasons. The bad reason is that it feels like an own revenue when it really isn't, right? Local governments are getting the share without having to set the rates. They're not politically responsible for rate setting, but they feel like this is they're getting what their economies are producing, and this has and they're getting it without sort of begging to the national government for grants. So the opposition or the hostility or the suspicion of grants is fulfilled by a statutory share of pit, and the pit looks nice because we're getting what we generate. And pit sharing, in general, seems, at least in the countries that I know best, to have stimulated mayors to pay a serious attention to job creation in their jurisdictions without unleashing huge amounts of fiscal competition. At the same time, in Eastern Europe, at least, one of the conditions of entering into the world economy was that the IMF's requirement that everybody develop or impose a VAT, develop and impose a VAT, and that kind of relieves a lot of pressure on the central government for their major source of revenue. But the paradox that I think is at the heart of my thinking about this stuff is that providing municipalities with large percentages of their revenue through a share of the personal income tax makes, ironically, equalization both technically easy and politically less contentious. All right? Equalization is always contentious and always a problem, but strangely, when you're using pit sharing as the basic source of municipal revenue, it is technically very easy to create an equalization rule that is based on a uniform assessment of relative wealth, pit per capita, and which is a direct budget revenue itself. It is not a proxy measure. So one of the big fights about equalization is always, how do you measure it? And if the measurement isn't the same as the device that's filling the budget, it becomes very abstract and very politically contentious. The argument here is that if we know PIT per capita, the average is 100, we can set up an equalization grant that equalizes to some percentage of the national average. And the Polish rule has been reasonably popular. I think the Polish rule actually came from the Germans, which is that if your average, if your PIT per capita is less than 90% of the national average, you're entitled to an equalization grant equal to the number of your population times 90% of the difference of your average and the national average. In any case, the equalization systems have worked pretty well, particularly in Poland. I'm not sure how well elsewhere, but they provide a strong foundation. And in lots of ways, I think the Polish model of municipalization can be seen as something like the poor man's version of Scandinavia. In any case, in the 1990s, the model goes viral through emulation and export, and I think just the reality that nobody had a viable property tax and everybody wanted to give municipalities more functions than they could anywhere near meet on the basis of own revenues. So shared taxes seem preferable to grants, and the personal income tax seemed particularly appropriate. As we'll hear in a moment, Croatia went farther, and they used both a PIT sharing system and then allow, if the information I have is still correct, larger jurisdictions to impose local surcharges. So they get the benefit of both a stable tax sharing system, easy equalization, and some of the benefits of true own revenues. It's as I said, I think the key here in many ways is that it's made equalization politically and technically less contentious, and while preventing the bottom from dropping out. And I'll leave us with the question that I started with and didn't answer, which is, why hasn't PIT sharing become a more central part of the discourse about decentralization and development elsewhere? So that's what I got to say, and thank you for taking the time to listen to it. Now let me see if I can shut off my share. Nice.
Thank you, Tony. This is really, really great. Thank you for all these insights and also for closing with this very relevant question. And I'm sure that we'll have an opportunity to follow up after we conclude with the other two interventions.
Wait a minute. Now, how could there we go.
Yeah. So I would, if anyone has already other questions, if you have already questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, and this is going to help us frame the next phase of Q&A. In the meantime, I would also invite you to reflect a little bit more on the question that Tony posted at the end. Why hasn't this become mainstream at some point? So I'm sure that this is, your perspectives will be very enriching to this conversation. So thank you once again, Tony. And now I would invite Dario to continue with the presentation of the personal income tax sharing in Croatia, where PIT sharing is one of the most important sources of revenues for municipalities. And there have been that it has been subject to recent reform. So we look forward to hear more from you, Dario. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alton, and thank you all for inviting me to this event today. It's a pleasure to be here. And listening to Tony, parts that address the situation in Croatia currently, I can only agree with everything he said. It's really all about the easy equalization and stuff like that. But let's dive into the current environment and upcoming reform. Let me just see how to put this in a full screen. Can you see it in the full screen?
Not yet.
Okay. I
All
guess
right,
that
this
should be
is
it.
thank you. It
Thanks. So just a little bit of background so you understand the environment. Croatia is basically divided into 20 counties, which are regional units. And then every county is further divided into towns and municipalities. And we have a capital city of Zagreb, which has dual status of local and regional government. Regional level pretty much carries the financially intensive tasks like health and education and some social services. And the regional level is primarily funded through the governmental transfers. On the other hand, local level runs local services like childcare, firefighting, infrastructure development, and local level pretty much relies on shared and own taxes and fees to finance their operation. Personal income tax is one of the major shared tax revenues for local governments in Croatia. And we do have a fiscal equalization system in place that addresses regional disparities. Just like Tony said, it pretty much provides funding to cover the fiscal gap between the actual revenue per capita of a municipality with national average. So in terms of fiscal arrangements, like I said, personal income tax is single most important revenue source. Currently, it's about 42% of total local government revenues. Although the graph could be a bit misleading, the personal income tax is not shrinking, it's growing, but at a slower pace than investment grants and the general grant. In terms of local fees and local taxes, local governments have a discretion to set the rates of those within certain limits imposed by the national legislation. And there are certain smaller local fees where local governments are given freedom to set all of the parameters of such fees and taxes, and there are no caps on such rates. Fiscal equalization has been recently amended to include several other sources of revenue for local governments, where local governments have a discretion of setting the rate, like rent tax and pretty much the tourist related taxes. So now fiscal equalization takes into account any such taxes to incentivize local autonomy. The system in place pretty much encourages local governments to increase those rates or utilize those rates in order to get as close as possible to a national average. In functional grants, that's a tiny part of the personal income tax sharing. They are given to local governments and based on service performance needs indicators. Pretty much the national government sets minimum standards for service provision, and then grants are in place to provide funding to those local governments who cannot fund the minimal standards from the personal income tax share they receive. In a nutshell, personal income tax in Croatia is residence-based. The current rates in 2023 are 20 and 30%. And then local governments are given the freedom to set a local surcharge on top of the PIT rate. Local surtax can range between 0 and 18%. But the actual allowed rates depend on the size of the municipality. For the smaller ones, the rate can be set from 0 to 10, and then exclusively for the capital city, they can go up to 18%. The larger cities and other cities are somewhere in between. Currently, when we speak about the personal income tax, government sets the tax rates, tax base, tax deductions, pretty much all of the parameters except the local surcharge. And it also sets the sharing percentages. Local governments are the recipients of the funding, and just like Tony said, they consider it their own. They're happy about not having to deal with the tax rates. But on the other hand, every second year, they're not so happy about the tax rates because the government keeps pushing tax rates towards lower rates. At a certain point, one of the highest VAT rates was 40%. Right now, the highest VAT rate is 30% for a fraction of the income. And basically, the 30% rate captures only 11,000 people throughout Croatia. So we're really at the edge of flat VAT. Another odd characteristic of a personal income tax in Croatia is numerous deductions that are being provided by the government. The youth deduction for people up to 25 years, they are completely exempted from paying personal income tax. For those between 25 and 30 years old, they have a 50% discount. Then the retired persons, they have 50% discount. People living in disadvantaged areas, they have another exemptions. So pretty much 55% of taxpayers in Croatia, when it comes to personal income tax, are exempted from paying. So we actually have a minority of taxpayers paying personal income tax. On the right-hand side, you can pretty much see that. I'm showing the effective personal income tax rate, and you can see that although our rates are 20 and 30%, the effective rate is somewhere about 8% because of the numerous exemptions we have. But personal income tax is non-earmarked revenue. Local governments therefore like it because they can utilize it according to the local investment and service provision priorities. Surtax is considered as the own tax revenue, so it does not go into a sharing mechanism. It stays with the local government that introduced surtax, while personal income tax is going through a sharing mechanism that provides 74% of collected VAT to cities and municipalities, 20% to counties, and 6% is used for decentralized functions. It's automatically transferred to those local governments who are providing one of the decentralized functions. So in total, 100% of the personal income tax is allocated to local governments, and that might be one of the reasons, like Tony asked, why, at least in Croatia, it's not really being considered for decentralization, for encouraging decentralization. I mean, local governments already have, subnational governments already have 100% of the PIT, and it does not seem that increasing PIT rates to fund decentralized services is an option. So we're more thinking along the lines of utilizing property tax as a vehicle to fund decentralized services. By the way, Croatia does not have a personal property tax. We're still relying on a communal fee, which is some sort of property taxation system. And to look at the current reform, the legislation is in place already, voted by the parliament. And as of January 1, we are going to see some changes in the system. The government is no longer going to set the tax rates. The government has set the band within which local governments can set the tax rates on their own, which is between, for a lower level, between 15 and 23.6%. and for the part of the wage for higher earners is between 25 and 35.4%. Basically, this range is set as such that local governments can compensate for the fact that surcharge was terminated. So the city of Zagreb can set the rate of 23.6%, which equals to the previous 20% plus 18 surtax. There's an interesting bit in the PAT setting rates. Just in case if local government does not decide on the new personal income tax rates, the default personal income tax rate will be 20 and 30%, just like before, so that there are no gaps in setting tax rates. Central government still sets the tax base and tax deductions, so there is some level of control still in hands of the central government, which is not surprising because personal income tax is one of the larger and more important taxes in Croatia. The government has simultaneously increased the tax rate on capital or asset income, basically rent and dividends, by 20%. So far, for dividends were taxed by 10% personal income tax, and as of 2024, it will be taxed with 12% PIT. So we're seeing a lot of commotion on a business side. Some of the dividends being paid prior to the January 1 to capture the lower rate right now. The PAT is continues to be a share tax revenue. It's shared just as it used to be shared before, and it keeps its non-earmarked character. But the point of the government and the whole income tax reform was to address some deficiencies in local fiscal autonomy. So on the left side, you can see a tax autonomy in 2023 for local governments. The red is being set by the central government or our revenue sources, which are under heavy control of the central government. And the green ones are sources that are at discretion of local governments. So now on the right-hand side, you can see projected change in 2024. Local governments will have a large control over shared and own local taxes, and there will be still a significant part of grants and other revenue that are going to remain under control of a central government. So this is pretty much it when it comes to tax reform in Croatia, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Back to you, Oltan.
Thank you, Dario. This is very, very exciting to see in the more details on how in one of these European countries personal income tax had been set up and how it is being reformed, the objectives behind the reforms, and hopefully we'll get to more tax autonomy as well. As in the case of Tony, you please take the time to think about the questions that you have for Dario and the case in Croatia. We already have a couple of questions for Tony and Dario in the chat. So please feel free to write your questions for Dario there too, and we'll address them later on. Now I would like to invite Kudadat for the presentation of the work that they have been doing on personal income tax reform in Indonesia. So we're going from in another part of the world, and then definitely I personally am very, very interested to see how's that going. So Kudadat, please feel free. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elton. A very good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. I'm based out of Jakarta, so it's a little bit late for me, but hopefully I'll be able to convey the findings from the report and the work that we've done. Let me try to share my screen. Sorry. Can you all see the PPT?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, we can see it. Not full screen, but
Perfect.
okay, now it's full screen. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. So basically, I'll be summarizing this work that we've done jointly together with Jürgen Bloom at the World Bank and Professor Roy Kelly. Basically, we've been working together with the government of Indonesia consistently over the last 2 to 3 years on their biggest fiscal reform on decentralization that came out last year, which was Law 1/2022. This was 2 to 3 years of work from our side. And one of the subcomponents of this work was basically on personal income tax piggyback. So hopefully in this presentation, which would be a very short one, I'll summarize some of the key findings of our work. Broadly speaking, what I want to do today is I want to answer two types of questions. The first is just to give you some context about the fiscal decentralization context within Indonesia, and to give you a sense of the subnational revenue challenge within Indonesia. I think it's pretty well known within decentralization circles that vertical fiscal gap is a massive challenge. So I'll sort of cover the same in a little bit of detail at the start, so that you get a sense of where Indonesia stands on decentralization. The second part of the presentation is going to focus on personal income tax piggyback. And the interesting thing is, in the previous presentations that Anthony and Dario were mentioning, some of the themes are actually quite similar, which basically these were the questions that we were also asking. So it'll be interesting to have that discussion at the end. Let me get us started by giving you a little bit of the decentralization context within Indonesia. So Indonesia happens to be a heavily decentralized country when it comes to spending responsibilities. And that you can see from the graph over here, where you look at the yellow line. The yellow line basically shows you the share of subnational government expenditures out of total government expenditures. Indonesia has 3 layers of government. You have your central government, provincial governments, and your district governments. Together, the district and provincial governments constitute around 50% of spending. And that's been since 2001, when a massive decentralization effort was introduced. A lot of spending responsibilities were passed down to subnational governments, primarily to districts, but somewhat also to provinces. So it's a context where most of spending on education, on health, and on a lot of sectors is done by the subnational governments. But there's a massive vertical fiscal gap. What that means is basically the subnational governments primarily rely on intergovernmental transfers to finance their spending. And that you can see from the graph over here. Again, I'll focus on the yellow line here. Yellow line shows you the share of your total revenue for the districts that comes from own source revenue. So the revenue bases that have been assigned to the local government, to the district government, what share of revenue actually comes from your own source revenues. And you can see over here, I want to point out two things. Look at the line in 2020. The absolute number for the share of money that's coming from own source revenues for districts is around 15%, which is very low. So the majority of the spending, actually, a majority of the financing actually comes from intergovernmental transfers, primarily from the block grant that's given from the central government, which equalizes the difference between fiscal needs and fiscal capacity. Now, it's not all bad news. If you look at the trend of the yellow line from 2009 till 2020, there has been improvements. That's because in 2009, a lot of revenue bases were decentralized to the subnational governments, particularly to districts. And a few examples are the recurrent property tax, a classic case of a good sort of tax where the tax base isn't going to move around and it's easy to give to a district government. It makes sense to give it to a district government. So some of these taxes were given to the district governments in 2009, and that led to an increase in your own source revenue mobilization at the local level. Now, that didn't come with without its challenges. it came with a significant number of challenges, which I won't get into. But one type of challenge was that, this was being the property tax was being managed at the central level. Now, all of a sudden, you give it to the subnational government without like any training. Then all these governments need a lot of it requires some patience for them to sort of catch up with the administration and compliance of these taxes. But that part I won't be going sort of too much into. Now, where does personal income tax piggybacking fit into this entire sort of picture of, subnational governments basically relying primarily on central government transfers to finance their spending? Of course, I think in this room, I don't need to make a case for why revenue mobilization at the local level is important, why it's important to have district governments and provincial governments basically fiscally independent so that they collect their own revenues, closing the vertical fiscal gap. So this was pretty much all of the reasons that were on the radar of the finance minister as well a few years ago. So if you went back 3 years ago, a lot of the discussions in Indonesia were fiscal decentralization is very important. We are a heavily decentralized country, and the messaging from the top was we need to change. This is the right time for the reform. The president was also having a second term, and he had a lot of political sort of capital. So there was the right sort of circumstances to be able to do a massive fiscal reform. And this reform effort basically culminated in Law 1/2022, which came out last year. Now, we've been working closely with the government of Indonesia, particularly with the Ministry of Finance, on providing technical assistance to them. And that is wide-ranging. We've basically done a lot of work, technical work on many different types of things that they were thinking of introducing. One of the things that they came to us with was, they said, we've heard that personal income tax piggybacking is a nice and fancy instrument. Should we introduce it as a subnational government revenue instrument? Because the Ministry of Finance sets your overarching legal framework for subnational revenues, right? It assigns revenues to subnational government. It assigns revenues to central government. So then they came up us with a question saying, look, we've heard of this instrument. Should this be introduced as a subnational government instrument? Without having a lot of knowledge of actually what it is, whether it's been implemented in other countries, what are the pros and cons? And so we basically went about doing some research and trying to understand what existing work has been done on PIT piggybacking, which there is very limited work on, and then sort of to apply it to the Indonesian context. The reason for publishing this report was because we felt that there's very little work that applies to PIT piggybacking for middle-income countries. So we thought it would be a useful piece to sort of put together. Because if we are struggling with this question, perhaps other countries are also considering whether it's a good enough instrument to sort of introduce or not. But first, I guess, some definitions on what PIT piggybacking is. We first in the report basically set out to define what different types of instruments or revenue instruments for subnational governments are and what they sort of imply. So personal income tax piggybacking is simply speaking a subnational revenue instrument. It's a subnational government surcharge on the taxable income or income tax liability of the central government. So the key here is the central government, in very simple terms, is already collecting a PIT. The subnational government comes in, they implement a surtax in addition to the PIT. The rate is set by the subnational government, and the central government already is collecting that money, so they'll collect that additional surcharge. The reason why the government was interested in this in the first place was because Indonesia suffers from a lot of compliance issues at the subnational level, right? The revenue instruments that are given to the subnational governments already are very difficult for the local governments to manage. They have like several sales-based taxes. They have the property tax. Valuations are not done regularly. Restaurant, hotel taxes, the sales-based taxes have a lot of under-reporting issues. So then the central government felt a little bit uneasy giving additional revenue instruments when that capacity is lacking. So that they thought this is a little bit of a hybrid instrument that might work. On the figure over here, you can see that we basically listed out different subnational revenue instruments on a scale of discretion, right? So let's say if you go on the leftmost side, then you have like, your intergovernmental transfers, unearmarked or earmarked. The subnational government doesn't have much of an authority in collecting them. There's some set out formula. You get that money. You don't have much sort of discretion. You do have expenditure discretion in some cases, like in the Indonesian context, where you're getting that money from the central government, but you don't have that revenue discretion. Now, if you move it towards the extreme right, then you have your own source revenues where the revenue instrument is completely with you and you collect it yourself as well. That's a pure own source revenue. Now, somewhere in the middle is something called a PAT piggyback, which the subnational government sets the rate and the central government basically collects that tax. So you are piggybacking on the sort of already the tax capacity that is there at the central level, and the subnational government is the one that's actually setting the rate. So in some ways, it looks the Croatia case to us was very interesting, which I will go to in a little bit more detail. Our case, because the report was published in January, doesn't capture the recent reforms. But yes, that's one thing that we looked at in a lot of detail. The next question for us was, when it comes to PAT piggybacking or versions of it, what are the types of countries that actually implement it? Is there any middle income country that actually has implemented it in the first place or not, right? So from our analysis, we find out that PIT piggybacking, whenever it is actually implemented, or a local PIT, decentralized PIT, we basically club both of them, is mostly a high income sort of country phenomenon. It's not a middle income country phenomenon. And PIT also happens to be a high income country tax as well, right? If you look at Indonesia, Indonesia is not collecting any PIT to begin with. 8% of their total collections are from a PIT to begin with. And that is the case across the board. If you look at low income, middle income countries, PIT is a very small revenue instrument. So then one natural question for us was whether it makes sense to add an additional subnational surcharge when the PIT base is already sort of so low, or whether it makes sense to wait it out when the country is high income, when the PIT base is larger, when you're collecting more, that's when you introduce the surtax. That's the sequencing question that we actually sort of were very interested in. We map out the benefits of introducing a PIT piggyback. One is very obvious, which is, you introduce a PIT piggyback, that will reduce your vertical fiscal gap. It will provide additional own source revenues for the local government. Local governments become a little bit more fiscally independent. It doesn't require additional sort of capacity. If you have that concern, which is, Indonesia is a very diverse, very large country. It's above 500 districts. It's 270 million people. One district in a far-flung area is very different from like a developed part of Jakarta, right? So capacity really varies. And so for the central government, this happens to be a big concern that, if capacity really varies, should we really fully decentralize the tax or not? Then solutions like a hybrid PIT piggyback, where the central government is already has that capacity, you piggyback on that capacity, becomes useful. And we have revenue simulations to show that it will improve your own source revenues. It's in the annex slides. I won't go into too much detail. We did a geographical analysis on what districts would earn more or less. And so, of course, there's a distributional side of it, which we also discuss. Again, something I won't go into in this presentation. The second part, which is the important and the tricky part, is it may improve the fiscal contract, which is the relationship between your citizens and your local government at the subnational level, right? That's the whole idea behind making districts and provinces more fiscally independent, because then if they're the ones, the local governments are the ones collecting that money, then citizens can be like, okay, are you providing me with the required services? So it creates that positive feedback loop. A caveat is, the evidence on whether this fiscal contract loop is going to hold or not is not really there, right? So we're talking in theoretical terms, but in theory, this should hold, right? If the subnational government has the power to set the rate, you will automatically get that impact. But there are three important conditions that we discuss in the work that are really important for this fiscal contract loop to work. The first is that the subnational government must have the autonomy to set the rate. If they don't have the autonomy to set the rate, then the PIT just looks like a PIT sharing mechanism. It doesn't look like a piggyback anymore. The reason why we highlight this is because the central government basically on several times came to us and said, we'll introduce a PIT piggyback, we'll call it a piggyback, but there'll be no discretion for the subnational government to set the rate. And we said, look, you want to call it a piggyback, you want to call it whatever, that looks like a pure tax sharing arrangement. So that's one thing that we highlight in our report. The second, I think, a really important thing is that you need to have updated taxpayer residence information, which I think one of the I think Tony was alluding to earlier, which is very important, because if you don't know where people live, then how are you going to be able to allocate? How is that fiscal contract relationship actually going to work out? And this problem can also introduce gaming, right? Like, because if PIT surtax rate or piggyback rates are different across districts, then that in the long run can also create incentives for people to stay in one district versus the other, especially when you're close to the border areas. We don't really know whether this holds in practice, and that's a hard question to sort of look at econometrically in the absence of data, but that's one thing that we sort of highlight. We also sort of look at this question of sequencing, which I was mentioning. So one question was whether you introduce a PIT piggyback right now, or whether you introduce it later in the future when the PIT base is larger. We are of the opinion that I think it's better for middle-income countries to sort of, if they want to introduce it, better to expand the base first, and then you introduce the surtax. And even more important, better to introduce it once you have good residence information for taxpayers. And we basically looked at like some case studies. So Denmark and Canada, like the speakers were mentioning previously, these independent subnational PIT systems that developed there. We look at the Croatia case, which basically we classify as an additive approach, where you already have a central government PIT and you add a surtax on top of that. We thought option 2 was more relevant for the Indonesian context, because that's exactly what they were considering. After that, we basically organized a peer learning webinar with colleagues in the tax authority in Croatia, who basically explained the dynamics of how it works. Now it's gone through a new reform, as Dario was mentioning earlier, so it looks very different now. But what we've documented is what it looked like previously, and what were the issues or challenges that the government was facing in its implementation. And the report has like details on these case studies. For further details, you can, easily, just the title of the report, if you look it up, you'll easily able to find it. We've also summarized the findings in a blog to make it sort of more accessible. But the broad summary is that it's a hybrid instrument that can be introduced in the Indonesian context. It can increase own source revenues for subnational governments, but it requires some administrative preconditions for it to be successful, which includes the ability to tell taxpayer information, or residence information, and to have a relatively broad sort of tax base. So that's what the work is. Hopefully, I've been able to summarize it reasonably well. Let me stop there and pass it back to you, Elton. I would love to hear any questions or comments from the participants. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Kuda. This was really, really interesting as well to see in further detail an ongoing reform effort, and what were the objectives, and also the different options that you had considered. So, thank you for making this. Now I think that we can move to the next phase. In the chat we have a couple of questions. I saw that Tony has already provided some of the responses. But Tony, if you don't mind, you can elaborate a little bit more on those points, and maybe then I could add a little bit more also on Albania, building also on the fact that our colleague and friend Fran Brahimi from the Ministry of Finance of Albania, he's joining the conversation as well. So PIT sharing is not a big component of local finance in Albania, but we have one of the most typical challenges in our country. So maybe, Tony, if you can summarize these 2 points on the tension about the residents and also the workplace. I think this was also one of the questions that was made earlier. Thank you.
Okay, and Andrew asked, is the main reason why PIT sharing isn't so widely used in the developing world because just the collection of PIT is so low? I mean, I think that's true. I think that is in many ways a legacy of the IMF's structural adjustment programs and the search for optimal taxation, and the idea that taxes on direct taxes were a drag on growth of the 70s and 80s. And if you compare, how successful the IMF has been in pushing through VAT reforms as opposed to pushing through PIT reforms, it's instructive. So that's one reason. But the basic reason, I think, is that in many developing countries, the national government uses companies as tax agents, and they rely on the companies. This is the case in Ukraine, which is I know best, to distribute either to collect the revenues or to distribute the revenues to local governments if personal income tax is being shared. And that makes little sense, though it's exactly what goes on in Romania and Ukraine, and it was what stopped, I think, serious thinking about using PIT sharing as a municipal revenue in Albania from taking steps forward, because the investment in the IT systems that would need to be made to allow the national government to allocate PIT by place of residence were prohibitive, and the data on where people live and the requirements for where people to register where they live would have to be changed. So I don't know if that gets at everything that was asked, but I'll stop there for the moment. I mean, I have questions for both Dario and Kudret, if I may.
Please feel free to go ahead, but maybe we finish. You can write the questions in the chat as well, and then
I did
follow up. Yeah, this is a very good summary of what was mentioned about the tensions, about place of residence and place of work. In Albania as well, we have the same challenge. Unfortunately, our tax system is not able to differentiate taxpayers on an origin basis. So we know where the companies are located, and the PIT that is paid by the companies, it's concentrated in the major urban hubs, and that's a tension. One proposal that we have had earlier on this, Tony, you may remember this when we were working together with Fran, was to try to create a system and link the civil register data of where people are living and reside officially with the tax administration tax system. So basically, this is about further enhancing the tax administration system. It could be done, but definitely needs a little bit more effort on this. And I see that Fran would like to intervene on this as well. Fran? Okay, so maybe I was wrong. But yes, in this case, in our case, this has been a tension, and we try to resolve this tension by temporarily allocating PIT revenue on a per capita basis as well. So to some extent, following up on the unconditional grant or the general grant allocation. But we had also a question about for Dario. Remember here?
Yeah, I've seen those questions. Maybe I can reflect
quickly
on those, and if there are any sub questions. So John was asking if the residents are complaining about infrastructure degradation due to the people who are coming for work in the city where they are not resident. And no, we really don't have that kind of issue. But on the other hand, we do have a lot of local governments complaining about the tourists and the strain they put on the infrastructure, because some typical smaller local government with maybe 10, 12,000 inhabitants will during the summertime have 40 to 45,000 inhabitants. And that puts immense pressure on the infrastructure, or requires you to build an oversized infrastructure that has extreme operating costs for such a small residence base. So they are complaining a lot about the tourism strain, but yet they are keeping the tourist taxes low. So that's That's a funny one. Charles was asking about the concerns that central government tax agencies are not as efficient when collecting the PIT if PIT is local revenue. We don't have that issue. We don't have those concerns because we have personnel and tax reporting requirements and systems which are highly digitalized and are heavily enforced by the central government. So we don't have the concerns when it comes to PIT, but there are some other smaller taxes where the compliance is not as strictly as enforced. And that's where the local governments believe, and some have proved that they can be more efficient in collecting such local tax revenues. And Tony, yeah, the equalization system, how did moving to a true local PIT affected the equalization system? It pretty much remained the same. We're equalizing local government revenue per capita to a national average. We've kept the same funding level as before. We have improved the formula that calculates transfers to individual local governments in such a way to encourage the use of local taxes, especially when it comes to property and tourism. Those are two that are under taxed, I guess. So this is all I have.
Can I ask a follow-up on Dario's question, on Dario's answer?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Are we entering to the exchange?
Is the equalization system based on an average set of pit rates, so you're equalizing to the average yield so as not penalizing the ones that are taxing more, or this isn't, so that if you tax more, you're actually going to end up, there's going to be more equalization required in the system?
Yeah, I hear you. We pretty much calculate the tax potential as a baseline. So if you introduce the maximum tax rates you would have 100. And the target rate is 150. So you will get 50. But if you have decided to keep the tax rates low and you are only getting 80, then you will not be getting 70 to reach the national target. You will be still getting 50 because your tax potential is 100.
Okay, so you are standardizing in some ways the rate.
Yeah, we're trying to not to discourage or we're trying not to encourage race to the bottom.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and thank you, Dario, as well. I see that Glenn has raised his hand. Glenn, if you don't mind, there's the question for Kudadat in the chat that came a little earlier, and then after Kudadat takes that, we go right ahead to your question. Thank you. Kudadat, please.
Thank you very much, Elton, and thank you, Anthony, for the question. It's a big question on whether the view has changed, but I can tell you what the view currently here is in the Indonesia. We have a massive decentralization program, a big program on subnational revenues, right? So I think, and we worked together with like 5 to 6 district governments directly. We've gotten hold of their administrative data to understand what issues they're facing. So we wanted to push our understanding of what revenue mobilization issues there are in the first place. So I think the first thing that's pretty much on the radar, everyone seems to speak about, is vertical fiscal gap, getting the local government sort of independent. That is pretty much the same. I think that was the case beforehand as well. I think here there's relative consensus that the policy framework, by and large, is fine. The right revenue bases are with the central government. The right revenue bases are with the subnationals, with the provincial government and the local government. Most of the issues that we're finding out when we work with the districts are at the on compliance issues, right? And let me speak about property tax, which you were mentioning earlier, right? The whole question on whether property tax in developing country context can be a huge revenue lever, that remains a massive question mark, right? Because most of the governments that we go to, We saw 7 years, 8 years, they haven't updated their valuation. They have basically in Indonesia, they have like 3 types of valuation. One is your tax authorities valuation. Then there is the land valuation agencies valuation, and then there is the market valuation, right? And I mean, the amount of valuation there is already very low. 6, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, they never update it, right? So one question that keeps on coming up for us is this a worthwhile area to engage in when nothing seems to move because it's so political? Whenever we say we'll do a cadastre update, valuation update, it goes nowhere. And that's been done in the past. You will update all of the valuations. There's no uptake of it. It doesn't get updated. It's like a lot of money down the drain. So then the natural, at least where I personally come out, I can't represent, I can't say on behalf of the institution, but I feel like a better way is, rather than asking local governments to sort of value on a 2 to 3 year basis, which they clearly will never do, and they don't have the capacity, you should think about centralizing. You should think about combining it with the valuation agency. The valuation agency is already doing it. You combine that land valuation, at least you get some revenue gains out of it. So that's, I think, where we're at. The property tax part is a huge question mark, and I think other taxes like the sales-based taxes, like the property transfer tax, etc., they are largely, and the fuel taxes given to the subnational government, that's relatively sort of okay. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the question is really, again, for 20 or 30 years, I think everybody's attention and energies and money were focused on bringing the ad valorem property tax, America's great gift to the world, to the developing world. And I mean, in some ways, if there's a simple moral to the story is, I mean, I still am waiting to see the case where this has been done successfully. And I just think it should be kind of put at the back of the playbook as an instrument. And, that's kind of been something that I was very frustrated about when I was operating in this world as on a daily basis. And that's where the money was going, was into these the cadastre registrations and the valuation systems, and really nowhere has it paid off. So if there's a kind of take-home message, I think, of this discussion is, the property tax is nice if you got it, and in a lot of places, unfortunately, the Scandinavians let theirs deteriorate. That's one of the side effects of what they did. But the property tax, even in high-income countries, is yielding very little revenue at this point, with the exception of the Anglo-Saxons. So that's kind of just my editorializing on this.
Yeah. Absolutely. I absolutely agree with this. This is exactly what I felt when I worked with the local governments. And, when this activity started, it was pretty traditional. The activities listed out for us was do a property cadastre update, the same sort of the whole thing, probably, right? And then what then we argued for was, we said, it doesn't make sense. And we're not going to throw down like a few $100,000 to do a property valuation that's never going to be sort of used. So what we ended up focusing was, we said, look, our comparative advantage is to work with the local governments and provide them a feedback loop in closing the compliance issues, which is what we're doing now, right? Which is not expensive, it's cheap. You get their data, you provide them a feedback loop. So that's where we sort of end.
Thank you, Kudadad and Tony, for this exchange. Glenn, please feel free to.
Thank you. My question, or some comments, is to Kudada. I have read your reports. I thought it was very good and very balanced, in the way it was put in. There's a couple of things that I didn't quite get clear, because you put in quotations, income tax producing districts. I'm not clear what you meant by that, or what the meaning or the significance of that is in that. And just as a comment, you showed the countries, the high income countries that do the PIT piggyback. But what was interesting to me on there is all of those countries are pretty much low population countries. You put the US in, but in the US it's done on the surtax is done on the state level. So I think the distinction may be the size of the population of the country may have more of an impact on the possibility of doing this than anything else. So I don't know what the population breakpoint is, but I'm just saying that was what I saw from the countries that you listed. I didn't look at all the populations, but on the other thing I'll say is I support the property tax. And on balance, I think you'll find that with the technology and the cost benefit of the property tax, applying the property tax, you'll get more from it than you will from trying to implement this PIT sharing on the basis of residence. Because I don't know of any property that gets up and moves, but I sure know a lot of people, because I'm in Ukraine, who get up and move, and for a lot of reasons. So I support the property tax. I don't think you've put enough into it. And if you did a cost benefit analysis, I think you'd get more from the property tax on that basis than you would from the PIT sharing. PIT surcharge, I like that one. So that's all my comments.
I mean, empirically, Glenn, it's just not the case. If you look at the returns of the property tax as a percentage of GDP, even in the high-performing countries, you just can't get that much money out of it.
Well, if you can send me the reports that show that, I'd be glad to read them.
Well, I mean, the reports are, Canada gets 2.5% out of the property tax, which is, barely enough to fund teachers' salaries.
Well, you're making the point. Maybe they're not maximizing property tax collection.
Well, the Canadians are the high performers here.
Well, it still doesn't mean they're maximizing property tax collections.
Okay.
All right. Thanks to both of you guys for your insights and perspectives on this. I think this calls for another meeting where Kudadad and other colleagues from the World Bank and perhaps also the IMF could join. So it would be good to brainstorm a little bit more on the pros and cons of that. From my perspective, I think it's a process, and then for the same good reasons why the pit is important somewhere and it's not so important elsewhere. I think that's something that can be worked also for the issues, the political and technical issues with the property tax as well. In the region, in Southeast Europe, we see that it's not in the best scenario is generating up to 1.4% of the GDP, and that's the best case in one of the most inflated years with construction and so on. So it's quite challenging for the region, I would say. But anyways, Kudadad, you had a question, so please feel free to follow up on that. And I know that Fran, also from Albania, would like to share a few remarks on personal income tax sharing in Albania. And with this, I would remind you that we originally had left another 6 minutes, but we can make it, we can stretch it a little bit more to 10 minutes maybe, so that we can hear these perspectives. And if other colleagues and friends here would like to share more, please feel free to follow up with the question. And we can connect in a second. Thank you. So Kudada, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Elton. You are
Fran,
hearing
just
me?
1 second. Fran, just one
Okay.
second. Kudadad had okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Glenn, for those remarks. So when we say income tax producing districts, basically what we're meaning is where a lot of the income tax revenues attributable to the districts is coming from, and perhaps we should have been a little bit clearer in saying what that means. And broadly, the discussion was on what are the equity implications. So your districts that are the ones where a lot of your taxpayers are registered with high incomes and are paying property taxes, those are the ones that get most of this PIT surtax, right? So that's one thing that we just wanted to broadly cover and say there's a distributional side. The second point, the point that you made, is a very good point. Yes, there are several small countries. I think big countries are in the exception. That's one thing we were also struggling with when we said, okay, like big country, there's one or two of them that were there in the sample. So maybe that's the explanatory factor in it. So it's a valid point. And yeah, I mean, on the property tax, it would be great to have a discussion sometime on the. I'd love to see it grow. But yeah, I guess the concern in Indonesia has at least been that the valuations are just so difficult to get done, and even when you do them, they're not incorporated in the law. So is that resource envelope of spending that money on updating the valuation justified? But perhaps you're right that with new technologies it becomes cheaper and cheaper and become easier for people to actually the cost benefit analysis just works out the other way. So that's entirely possible. But thank you very much for those comments and that feedback.
Thank you, Kudadad. Fran, as I mentioned, we still have 4 minutes left. So please follow up on your remarks in Albania, and we can take one additional question if we have other ones. So thank you. Please, Fran.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Elton. I would like to give my congratulations for the presenters. It was a very interesting webinar. I heard many interesting things from the different countries and different experiences, and also Albania has the modest experience to give you. But years ago, when we drafted the local finance law, we put in the law for personal income tax as a share tax for the local governments. And after 2 or 3 years, we started to implement it. It was difficult because we didn't have enough the logistic and the things to implement it, because we have the difficulties to link or to have the interface with different systems in Albania. But Elton and Ton know very well, but we try to put some interface between the civilization system with the tax, general tax system, etc. Again, we are trying to do some investment and to interfere their systems to have the right channel to collect it and to distribute the personal income tax for the local governments. And the other aspects is, but the personal income tax, since 3 years ago, we distributed in quarterly way to the local governments the personal income tax for each municipalities, and the scheme that we distributed the personal income tax based in the number of population, as we did for the unconditional transfers for the local governments. But in the future, we will invest it in the different systems to have the right systems to distribute the money for each local governments and each municipalities. And this personal income tax we use as the equalization system. When we do the equalization money for the local governments, we use the data for each municipalities as a personal income tax, and this data we use to do the equalization for each municipalities. And except the personal income tax, we use the other share taxes. We use the share taxes because it is impossible for us to calculate the fiscal potential for the local governments. But in Albania case, it is difficult. It's very difficult because we don't have the right systems and right statistics to calculate it, everything for all the municipalities as the local fiscal potential. That's why we use the share taxes and don't use the own taxes for local governments, because if we'll take into account the own taxes, we'll have the big conflict between the principle for encourage of the collected of local tax and the share of or distributed the money. If we'll use, for example, the own taxes, we can encourage lazy for the local governments. That's why we use the share taxes to do the equalization. And one of them, the share taxes, is the personal income tax. And in the future, we'll try to open the discussion with the local governments to increase the partial of the share taxes. Actually, we distributed to the local governments only 2% of PIT. It is a very small part for the local governments. In the future, during this time, the local governments ask us to increase the rate for the local governments. That's why in the future we'll open a discussion to increase the rate, and also to do some investment to have the property systems for distributing the money for the local governments from the personal income tax. And for me, it was a very useful all the presentation to improve something with the personal income tax in Albania, especially the part of the PIT for the local governments. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Fran, for joining us, taking the time, also sharing your perspective on the challenges faced in Albania, but also the objectives for the future. I think that we can still take one more question. If someone would like to add more to this, we would be very happy to respond to them. Personally, I think this has been very, very useful to have these three exchanges, these three discussions from Tony, from Dario, and also Kudadab. And to some extent, it's also, I think, something that we should do also more often, to brainstorm more, also in that direction. Unfortunately, time is very, very limited for everyone. But I definitely now I'm convinced that I've missed very much of this part of my work. So that's it. Do we have any additional comments or suggestion or question from the colleague? No. Okay, then with this,
just one thing. Roy has also. I saw Roy is also here. Who's a co-author with myself on the report. Just wanted to mention that here.
Thanks, Kudadab. I already saw Roy, and already yeah. If you would like to mention something, Roy, feel free to jump in.
I have a question for Roy. As the eminence agrees here of all of this, I mean, are you seeing a shift in the discourse away from sort of focusing obsessively on the ad valorem property taxes, the sine non qua of local government revenues, towards pitch sharing in the world that you move in, or do you see them as sort of, I mean, you use whatever you think is best in a given situation? How do you see the evolution of this discussion?
Well, thank you for, I just got finished with one meeting. I came late, so unfortunately I missed the presentations. I look forward to being able to read through and to see the recording. I guess my inclination is that most countries are really using the property tax as kind of the basic tax for local government. The property doesn't move, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of advantages for that. The challenge, of course, is it's a very political tax. and therefore it's often very difficult to kind of get collecting. And of course, it's not only about valuation, but it's about all the other aspects of the property tax administration that are critical. But there are some really interesting reforms that are going on. I guess when Kudadat and I were kind of looking at the Indonesian situation, I think if we assume that the property tax is kind of a basic thing that we all need to kind of work toward improving, at the same time, if we depend only on intergovernmental transfers, and so revenue sharing from the income tax, in Indonesia, 20% of the income tax is shared down to local governments. The question is that tax sharing and the piggyback is very different. So the idea of own source revenues and trying to establish more of the fiscal contract with local governments, the question is it possible, in addition to the basic property tax, business regulatory fees, market fees, blah, 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 is it possible to kind of move away from a revenue sharing approach? And the personal income tax is kind of the logical one, that if it's possible to kind of, do you keep the revenue sharing and add the option of a surcharge? And that's why we were very interested in kind of looking at the Croatian case last year when we were looking at the situation. Dario, unfortunately, I missed your presentation. I'd love to find out what new is happening. I hear things are happening. But the idea was, can we actually, yes, focus on the fundamentals, but on the personal income tax, move away from kind of a revenue sharing to allow more of a local government levying the tax and establishing that kind of accountability with the citizens. Not all local, make it an optional so that people don't come to the central government and say, I need more money. And you say, no, you have the right to levy a surcharge, because many people will not do that because they don't like the accountability aspect, but they all want money from the central government. And so the idea is that if you could somehow give them the option to force them to establish that relationship with their taxpayers, that might be kind of one way to kind of move this in the right direction. But anyway, since I missed all the other presentations, I don't want to say anything that you've already covered. So I will just look forward to kind of being able to read see the video. So thanks.
Thanks for this, Roy. So I get this also the question from Tony. It brings us back to the basics. So it's a cycle. Huh? We move on very much with details and so on, and then we need some of these basic questions to bring us with our feet to the earth. So thank you very much for this very insightful perspective, Roy. Jamie, you started the meeting and then you get to close the meeting, man. So go ahead.
Not at all, Elton. You get to close the meeting. I did want to, I noticed that Roy joined just as there was a conversation on property taxation. All I wanted to do was take the opportunity to say, I think we should have a full session on this. This was a wonderful session about personal income tax sharing and piggybacking. And it was, I think, very exciting that we had 25 people in the room talking about what one might consider a very niche issue, but clearly is still very much alive. I'm confident that we can have a similar discussion. I know Roy is in The Hague right now with other property tax colleagues, so I'm sure he's already settled in that setting the questions that came up today. But I look forward to having a future session with Roy on property taxation that I'm sure will be equally exciting. But thanks to everyone on the panel for your very insightful presentations and discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Elton.
Thanks, Jamie. Indeed, I would also like to thank all three panelists for the very insightful presentations and remarks. It's very much appreciated and also refreshing. Thank you to all the colleagues that contributed with the questions and also with the discussion. That's what makes this kind of conversation much more interesting. So that's really great. And also, last but not least, I think that my colleague, co-chair Gundula, is still here. So I guess we have also an idea about the next session of the LPSA Subnational Finance Working Group, so property taxation. And yeah, looking forward to that as well. Thank you very much again to everyone, and we keep in touch. Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Kudada. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Great seeing you.
Thank you, Dario. Thank you for bringing us the latest on the Croatian reform.
Thank you for calling me. We should see each other more often.
Thank you, Roy, as well for your very insightful comments and suggestions. And indeed, we should try to do this more often. I very much appreciate it. It's great to see you, although electronically. I know you, and I have read a lot of your work. But it's very nice to see you in person, although electronically. Thank you.
It's good to meet you. Sorry I was late. I'll look at the recording and catch up.
Oh, definitely. We'll have also the presentations. My colleague Marina will put them in our website, so you can take a look at that as well. And on any additional remarks, it would be great to follow up. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.